Okay, we'll just go ahead and get started. Welcome to Green Drinks Beaufort, the April meeting. And our hope is that this may be our last Zoom meeting. Our goal is to meet in person in May. We have a couple of sites in mind that I think will attract a good crowd. And of course, we'll be responsible and keep everybody safe as well. But hopefully we've turned the corner and we can see each other in person again. So we're all very excited about that. So I want to welcome everyone and also let you know that if this is being recorded, so if there's anyone that you want to pass this along to, let us know, send an email and we can make sure that they get it. If you have any questions, please use the chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor down at the bottom, if you're on a laptop, I think it's on the right if you're on an iPad. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kaylor and his dog to talk about some things happening over the Open Land Trust.
Thank you, Lisa, and I'm glad everybody could join us today. We'll see how many of my dogs join me during this. But first, before we got into our speaker tonight, which I'm thrilled to hear about, and I hope you are too, we wanted to share with the Open Land Trust that there is several events coming up. This is our 50th anniversary of land protection here in Beaufort and surrounding counties. So we got our start back in 1971. And our big kickoff event is going to be on May 1st. We're having brunch on the bluff right there on Bay Street. So feel free to give us a call if you have any questions about it. But I'm going to share a quick video just to tell you all about the event. So here we go.
Hi, Kristen Williams here with the Beaufort County Open Land Trust. This year we're celebrating 50 years of land protection in the Southern Low Country. And we're starting off the year of celebration right here at 1806 Bay Street where it all began. I hope you'll join us on May 1st from 11 to 2 p.m. for brunch on the bluff with catering by Susan Mason with her famous crab cakes, mimosas, Bloody Marys, and live music. You can go to our website to purchase tickets or call us at the office at 843-521-2175. Look forward to seeing you there.
All right, so I hope that played okay for everyone. But I hope to see you there. So like the video said, check out our website or give us a call at the office if you'd like to purchase tickets. It will be a ticketed event. So, and then there's plenty more events to go throughout the year. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Mr. Al Stokes retired from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources as manager of the Waddell Mariculture Research and Development Center. He spent more than 40 years developing spawning and production techniques for recreationally important finfish and several marine shrimp species. Now he is employed as a shrimp production consultant for Zeigler Bros Incorporated, and they are an international aquaculture feeds company. Al is also a board member of the Beaufort County Open Land Trust and a member of the May River Watershed Action Plan Advisory Committee. Al's a volunteer for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and is a deputy state law enforcement officer. Tonight, he's going to be talking all about the Saltmarsh and the life cycles associated with it. So join me in welcoming Mr. Al Stokes.
Well, thank you. Would you like me to go ahead and share the screen?
Yes, sir. That would be great.
Okay, share screen. So I click on that. Is that right?
I don't see it yet.
Okay, then let me make it small and try it again. Hold on 1 second, share screen. There it is. Share,
There it comes.
there it
Oh,
comes. Let's show from the beginning. We're good?
yes, yes, sir. We are good. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So I put together this presentation that I hope you'll find interesting because it talks about something that we generally see every day. And a lot of us sometimes don't really think about how complex the Saltmarsh system is and all the parts that make up the system itself and its performance and how it impacts our daily lives as much as it does. So I put this together and I hope y'all like it and I hope you'll learn something from this presentation. First of all, you know, our saltwater drives the Saltmarsh system totally. And the ocean covers 70% of the earth, and about 97% of all water on earth is found in the oceans. The components found in seawater come from vents in the ocean floor and from stormwater erosion. So our rainwater is actually slightly acidic, and so it erodes our rock. And then this washes down into the rivers and streams and eventually gets into the ocean. And the primary makeup, there's like, I think 80 something ions or components that make up seawater. But the largest amount of ions come from chlorides, sodium, sulfites, magnesium, calcium, and so on. So it's a very interesting mixture of ingredients that make up our seawater. And worldwide salinity in our ocean water is around 35 parts per thousand or grams per liter. And it's that level of salt in the oceans worldwide because the oceans are mixed through volcanic activity in the ocean, the ocean currents, storms, the heating and cooling in the ocean moves water. So all of this, and it takes like thousands of years to be able to stir the oceans to mix the salinity to make it homogeneous worldwide. So it's kind of an interesting feat that this occurs. So 3.5% of seawater is actually salt. And if we were to remove the salt from the ocean, there would be enough salt to cover the earth in a layer that's 500 feet deep, and it would weigh 38.5 quadrillion tons. So there's a lot of salt in the oceans. It's interesting. And it's taken thousands of years to be able to extract the salts from the land and get it into the oceans. So where we live is fascinating. We're part of the South Atlantic Bight. It extends from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina to West Palm Beach, Florida. And a bight is a curve or a bend forming a bay. And the highest tides occur in our bight near the Georgia, South Carolina border. So actually, we're sort of in the center of this curvature, the center of this bight. And the unique thing about this area is if you look at it, if you look at it from Calabogie Sound and you go all the way up to the Broad River or Port Royal Sound and on, this area has its own watershed. There's no fresh water. There's no freshwater systems at all. It's all tidally controlled. So seawater comes in, seawater goes out. And the water that we get, any fresh water, comes from stormwater. That's why we hear so much about controlling stormwater in Beaufort County, because fresh water entering in a point source in our high salinity environments can actually be toxic. It can change the plants. It can change from Spartina to different types of more brackish water plants. It can ruin oyster beds. It can ruin spawning beds, can impact zooplankton, things like that. So it's very important, since we have no river systems here, that we're able to manage stormwater appropriately. Now, we do have headwaters here in the upper reaches of our estuaries that do get stormwater. We see some blackwater systems, but they only flow after heavy rains that we get here. Now, the thing that we're going to have to be looking at in the near future, and we've discussed it even in the Open Land Trust, is that as sea level rises, the saltwater systems are actually going to migrate inland. And so those areas will be impacted or now high ground, but eventually they could be on the edge of a salt marsh. And then we'll eventually lose some salt marsh, and we'll eventually lose some oyster beds. So that the whole system is going to metamorphose into something a little bit different than what we are used to seeing. So hang in there. We're going to see some changes, but it's also fascinating. But it's only because we live in this unique area in the South Atlantic Bight. So the most abundant salt marsh tidal creek systems occur in the southeast and the Atlantic coast. Georgia and South Carolina each have approximately 350,000 acres of salt marsh, followed by North Carolina and then Florida. Today's salt marsh tidal systems began to form about 12,000 years ago. And as sea level increased, saltwater moved inland, forming bays and lagoons behind our barrier islands. And the barrier islands were actually formed from sands and silt that washed down from rivers and eventually were deposited by tides crashing into some of the sandbars. And then you created these small barrier islands or hammocks, and we'll talk more about that. So the freshwater input from rivers and streams, they are a major contributor to the formation of our barrier islands and our mud flats. And this provides the substrate for our salt-tolerant plants called halophytes, and particularly our spartina. And this was able to establish itself, and then the marsh expanded. And stormwater runoff from adjacent lands in combination with the tides created what we call our tidal creeks. So the salt marsh ecosystem is highly productive coastal wetland found between the upland areas and the estuaries. It may be considered in some areas where there's a freshwater and saltwater mix, but we don't have that in Beaufort County. We have only a saltwater interface. And the intertidal habitat where the surface of the salt marsh is underwater at high tide and dry at low tide. A network of finger-like tidal creeks winds through the marsh and facilitates the movement of tidal water onto the marsh surface and back to the estuaries. So the behavior of all living things here in the low country, in the salt marsh area, is affected by the movement of our tidal waters. And you might look at it as that we're part of those living things too. I know if you go fishing, if you're going kayaking, you're going boating, you always consider what kind of tide are we going to have today? Because it's very important on how we live here. And the animals that live in the marsh are the same way. And you'll also notice in our tidal marshes that we don't have straight creeks, like a river running from high ground towards the ocean. They all meander in what we call a snake-like pattern. And this is also very important because if nutrients are washing in from stormwater and getting into these tidal creeks, it has an opportunity over a longer period of time to be absorbed by plants using this nitrogen, so it's not allowed to get out into the ocean and create undesirable algal blooms. So it's a benefit to that. Also, by curving like this, you don't see great deposits of sediment at the mouth of the estuaries. So a lot of it will settle down in these curves and form pockets. So at low tide, you see these little pools. And it's very important because a lot of finfish species actually trap themselves in those pools at low tide to keep from getting into the larger creeks and being consumed by predators. So the South Carolina tidal ecosystem has 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day. We have a semi-diurnal tide. Some places throughout the world have diurnal tides. They only have 1 tide a day, 1 high tide a day and 1 low tide. We have 2 high and 2 low each day. So these tides last about 6 hours. So it's formed because the Earth rotates once during a 24-hour period. But the Earth must tilt on its axis 12 degrees, or about 50 minutes, for the moon to be directly over the same place the next day. And so the moon takes a little extra time to do that, 50 extra minutes. So therefore, a tidal day is not 24 hours, but 24 hours and 50 minutes. That's why we all say, well, the tide will be, high tide will be an hour later than it was today, kind of thing. That's because of the rotation of the moon around the Earth. So this is just an example of your high tides and how they occur. And our tidal amplitudes can range from 6 to 10 feet during spring tides. And eventually they'll be actually higher than that. I feel sure they will be. So our spartina, a fascinating grass. And its stems and all are very dense and have the effect to be able to reduce tidal currents and facilitate deposit of fine sanded particles in sediment. And these sediments that are trapped by Spartina actually become your fluff mud. And we have in our marsh, we have 3 species of fiddler crabs. They're an environmental indicator. If there's pesticides around or something like that, something's not right in the environment, we'll start seeing a diminish in the population of fiddler crabs. But their burrowing activity is so important to Spartina. You couldn't have Spartina grass if you don't have our fiddler crabs. And because they can tunnel around the plants and they undermine the marsh banks, it can affect aeration of sediments, which increases the growth of marsh grasses. These activities stimulate the turnover and mineralization of important nutrients. Tunnels allow the drainage of hydrogen sulfide away from Spartina roots. And the hydrogen sulfide can actually kill those plants, but the tunneling actually lets it drain out. It also provides aeration and substrate. So bacteria like Vibrio parahemolyticus is one, they can actually fix nitrogen for Spartina plants. So fiddler crabs are an important part of the salt marsh environment, critical. So our temperature and sunlight abundance influence Spartina color and performance, and I'm sure you know that. In the spring, the plants begin to grow and take on a green color. In the fall, they take on a golden brown color. And by winter, the plants turn brown and die. Eventually, the stems break off and accumulate on the marsh surface, which we create mats called wrack. And then the wind and tides, decomposition by bacteria and fungi, and the grazing of marsh animals, such as our marsh periwinkle, snail, break the wrack into smaller pieces called detritus. And detritus serves as a phytoplankton nutrient. And it provides cover and food for zooplankton. So Spartina takes up nutrients when it's growing, and then it provides nutrients for other animals and to initiate a bloom in the spring for Spartina plants, the new growth that we will see. It provides nutrients to start phytoplankton production for our rotifers and our copepods. I think I got some. So this is your greening of the marsh. This is high tide in our marsh. And then the browning in the fall. And then the wrack that we see, we're very familiar with. And this is giving back. This is life giving back when it dies and breaks down and provides nutrients. And then it provides a food source for our copepods. And you'll see this copepod, it's a zooplankton, and it's carrying the eggs on the tail, and those eggs will hatch out and actually be a smaller version of this copepod, which is already small, but smaller types of fish could not eat an adult copepod, they'll eat the larvae. And then they'll go on up and eat the larger adult copepods. This initiates the whole food chain. All our recreational species that we love, including shrimp and crabs and red drum and spotted sea trout, they all feed on copepods. They also feed on rotifers, which benefit from the salt marsh phytoplankton production. And these rotifers are actually smaller than the copepods. And then their offspring is actually smaller as well. So there's a wonderful larval food chain is established in the salt marsh because of our Spartina. And I think this is what they look like under a microscope. This is a condensed sample. So this is just like a soup of life that is generated in the salt marsh. This is abundance of food, and then it's made up of larval fish and crabs and everything. It's just a tremendous stew of life. So we have what we call the high marsh, and this is the zone that's covered with salt water about 2 hours each day from the muddy low marsh areas. And the change in elevation may be only a matter of inches to the high marsh. And the high marsh or the high ground, it gets up into that area. So Spartina in those high marsh areas experience competition from resources from other plants, such as our black needle rush, saltgrass, and glasswort. These plants are salt tolerant, but can take advantage of available fresh water running off into the higher ground. Stormwater running into those areas, it lowers the salinity and makes it uncomfortable for Spartina, but these competitive species of plants, they'll thrive there. And you see this. This is the black needle rush. This is what sticks you in the legs when you're walking around the base of high ground areas, and you see the marsh border is what I like to call it. And then this is saltgrass, which thrives on the edge of the marsh too. You usually see them in a little more sandy area. And then one of my favorite is glasswort. I think this is a very neat plant. Changes colors. You see it in the sandy areas up at the high marsh, borderline of high ground. I like to, when I'm walking by it, I'll pick it up and chew on it. It's very salty in flavor. It's very pretty. And in fact, there's some companies now that are culturing it as a food source or a garnish in major restaurants. So glasswort has a salty taste and can be pickled. Some people pickle it. I just eat it raw, so to speak, or used as a garnish. When incinerated, glasswort produces soda ash that can be used as soap in glass making. So some of the early glass making in South Carolina, they use glasswort to do that. So our low marsh area is a title that I think is the most productive, and this zone spans from the high marsh to the Tidal Creek bank and may cover miles of habitat. This is the expansive marsh, so it holds salt water a good bit at a time. This area is covered with salt water at least half the day, and Spartina is the only type of plant that can live there. This area provides an abundance of food and habitat for our larger animals. So in this shot here, it's just perfect. It shows you rack, it shows you the high marsh, it shows you the border to the high marsh area where there's a transition from Spartina to needle rush. And then the muddy flats over to the left could actually have glasswort there and all. Then you can see the tidal creeks and then the barrier islands or hammocks there. So it's a beautiful area here that demonstrates the various parts of the marsh system that we have here in the Low Country. So our tidal creeks are branching waterways that meander through and shape salt marshes, and they're the ones that go snake-like that we're familiar with. And they are the major water link between the salt marshes and the open larger estuaries. These creeks are a conduit for stormwater runoff, fresh water to the open estuaries. These areas are mostly dry at low tide, forming those pools that I mentioned earlier that where small fish species can reside there. The tidal creeks serve important nursery areas for many species of fish and invertebrates. And you can there's a large list of these animals that use these areas. And even open ocean fish like grouper, barracuda, tarpon, and some snappers and cobia develop in these tidal creeks. And there's your more familiar small tidal creek, and it'll eventually go dry and form those pools. The larger tidal creeks, and then they go out into the larger estuaries, they drain there. This is right next to Waddell. This is what I got to look at every day for 40 years, so I really enjoyed it. But these tidal creeks are amazing and so productive. Then you have to look at what they provide us on the borders of these tidal creeks, and that's our oyster bars. And the oyster reef is recognizable habitat in the salt marsh tidal creek ecosystem. Our oysters spawn from April to October and dependent upon temperature, and they can tolerate salinity levels of 5 to 35 parts per thousand salinity, so up to ocean strength. And this is those areas where you got to be careful about stormwater, because if stormwater enters in a considerable point source area, then you can lower the salinity to a point where oysters can't thrive and you will lose that habitat. That's why it's very important to keep an eye on stormwater regulations and development and those type things that can have a negative impact on our salt marsh system. So oysters filter out phytoplankton for food and water clarification. They do a number of things. So if you're feeding on phytoplankton and you're an oyster, you can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. And by filtering and removing phytoplankton, you improve light penetration. And when you have sunlight, you're going to have photosynthesis, so it improves water quality, and it removes nitrogen and phosphorus. So having oysters is a good thing. It provides substrate and a source of food for a number of species, such as your polychaetes, blue crabs, stone crabs, and spawning substrate for fish. Oyster reefs stabilize bottom sediments for benthic organisms like clams and aquatic plants, and they concentrate food species for larger predators. And it's a very important food source for crabs, birds, starfish, boring sponges, and drills. Oysters are just the best. if you want to have a healthy environment. So there's the life cycle. It takes about 2 weeks after they spawn. They don't always spawn the same sex. They can change sex. So can clams. So we're spawning them in labs. We'll put a symbol on them to identify them as male or female at that time, but doesn't mean they'll spawn that way the next time. The larvae actually swim like little fish for a while. They feed, and then they'll in about 2 weeks, they decide they need to be an oyster, and they settle to the bottom, usually attach themselves to another oyster or to a piling or something like that, hard surface, and they'll cement their foot there and create these wonderful bars, which creates pools and traps sediment and do all these great things. So the part that I like about living down here, one of the fascinating things is looking at and exploring marsh hammocks. And these are small islands in the salt marsh, and they vary in size from much less than 1 acre to several hundred acres. And they provide a diverse plant and forest communities with oak, slash pine, wax myrtle, saw and cabbage palmetto, yaupon, holly, and salt cedar. Marsh hammocks are known for their rare maritime high calcium communities, thought to be a result of shell deposits by Native Americans. In fact, there's some trees that live in some of these areas that don't occur near the coast because they're only the pH. They cannot live in low pH, but they can live in these high calcium communities. Some unusual plant species found in the hammocks thrive relatively high pH soil, so it's a good habitat for them. And the hammocks provide food and nesting habitat for many species of songbirds. So songbirds, they rest during the daylight hours while predator birds are flying, and then they stop at these hammocks and these small islands, and they can rest in the understory before starting to fly again at night. So this is a real benefit, having the kind of substrate or habitat that we have here off of Beaufort County that you don't find hardly anywhere else. It's really good for our songbird populations. Diamondback terrapins, a variety of reptiles and amphibians have found some of the last remaining suitable habitat. Deer, bobcats, and wading birds can live there and raise offspring. And it's interesting too, because in some of these areas, if a big tree just falls over and you get a rain or groundwater seeps into that and creates a freshwater pool, it can establish a whole evolution of new life that moves into the area to feed on, to drink fresh water, use that area for themselves, and you can recruit various types of animals just because a tree fell over. And there's a number of studies that have shown that. There are 3,467 coastal islands, and of these, 1,862 are less than 1 acre, and 2,825 are less than 10 acres. 1/3 of these islands are protected from development, which is really good if you're a songbird. Beaufort County has more than any other county at 40% or 1,418 island hammocks here in Beaufort County. So this is really good stuff. So I hope y'all will be able to go out and explore them too. I love doing it. You can see some of the islands that we have here in the background. They also provide substrate for the native islanders or Native Americans that used to live here and pilot these rings, shell rings, these high mounds that were from oysters that were placed there. I like to go and look and see what I can find. Sometimes you pick up old artifacts. These date back thousands of years. I think the oldest artifact they found dated back to 11 or 12,000 years. And recently we had a tree blow over, and I was able to help remove the remains of an ancient person that was identified to have been buried there for well over 1,000 years. And he had artifacts there, turtle shells for bowls and that kind of thing buried with the body there. So those islands have always been inhabited by peoples a long time ago. I mean, they understand the value of the marsh habitat for providing food. And think about it, during winter months when game may be not plentiful, you can always make a living on oysters. So it's a fascinating area. So this is some more of the island hammocks. These are some taken up around Edisto. And so the people on Edisto are upset because the deer migrate from the forested areas inland at night, and they use these hammocks to hop, skip, and jump to get into into their communities and feed on shrubbery in the people's yards. So that's been a real problem in some areas, using hammocks for that reason. There are a number of animals that reside on these hammocks, large number of birds, reptiles, amphibians. There have been some amphibians identified now, and mammals as well, excuse me. Like our oyster catcher, love that bird. And I found this guy here. He was nice and cold, so that was good. And I'm taking up a lot of time, right?
You're good. We're enjoying it.
Okay, I got a couple more things, and I won't try not to take up too much time. One of the things that I started looking at is the animals, some of the animals that benefited from the coastal or salt marsh and the islands, the hammocks and stuff, like our diamondback terrapins, which were almost eradicated at one time to make back in the 1920s for terrapin soup. These guys are really cool. They're raising them at Waddell and doing some studies, genetic studies with those. So they've been numbering them and feeding them. They love pellets because they'll feed on clams and oysters and all, but it's a lot of energy to crack a shell where you can get a soft fish pellet with high in protein, so they grow a lot better. Or blue crabs benefit from the salt marsh. I'll just run through some of the species that we spawned crabs one year. That was quite interesting. You can see that female, she can carry up to like 5 million eggs. She's very active in moving around to get water to move through the eggs, keep them aerated. And this is a new hatch batch of crabs. So this is what I was talking about, the soup of life when we're talking about the estuaries around here. This is just a sample out of a tank where a crab had spawned. And so the fish will feed on this red drum, trout, anything that can eat this, they will, as part of the zooplankton population. And this is a larval crab. And crabs. And then your Atlantic white shrimp, we spawn those as well. And they're a big benefit. A female can carry 200,000 eggs and they all spawn. And our spawning will be coming up again in May, end of May. They'll be spawning here. And we'll have some nice roe shrimp available. These are roe shrimp too, ready to spawn. They're conditioned for spawning. You can see the ovaries are nice and orange right here. You tag the female around the eye when you're spawning them, so when they molt, they don't lose the tag, and you can identify her as a productive shrimp. And the male, and then the male places spermatophore right here, and she'll pull it apart and fertilize the eggs. And then you have several naupliar stages. This is a newly hatched baby shrimp. Looks like something out of Star Wars. And then they metamorphose over a period of weeks and turn into a little baby shrimp. So you can stock them or feed on them, whatever you want to do. And snapping shrimp, these live in the edge of the salt marsh and the oysters, in the oyster banks. And these guys are the coolest things because they're very small, 1 to 2 inches, and they burrow in the banks. And they have this claw, which isn't really a claw. It's more like a pistol with a hammer on it. And they can snap that claw, and it emits a powerful wave of bubbles capable of stunning fish. That's how they hunt. They stun a fish, and the bubbles can travel up to 60 miles an hour, and the heat generated from bubbles crashing reaches almost the temperature of the sun. So they've been known to knock out the sides of aquariums and things like that, but they stun fish. They feed together on the oyster marshes, and you can hear them sometimes at low tide making a snapping noise in the marsh. And then their prey is probably, that's their prey. And then the mantis shrimp is probably my favorite. These are called prawn killers or thumb splitters because they got a sharp edge on the shell. And if you grab them, and they'll kind of coil and they'll cut you. And I've seen them up to 11 inches. I think the largest one's up to 18 inches. They mate for life. They bond and mate for life. And they can live up to 20 years. So you'll see those in the salt marsh too. This is a large one here. Oh, and they have real neat eyes. we only have possessed 3 types of color receptive cones. They have 16 types. So I believe they probably see colors that we don't even know about. So they're cute. And then we got, of course, red drum that live in the marsh. We are all familiar with that. We spawn those too, Waddell. So these are red drum. They thrive in our marsh area. They're grown. Recreational fishermen love them. These are spotted sea trout. We grow those. We've grown those at Waddell. Frank will love this photo. And of course, cobia. I'll show you something. This is cobia eggs. Cobia larvae. This is a 48-hour-old cobia getting ready to become a predator. His eyes have developed. He's getting his pigmentation. This is a 72-hour cobia at the bottom here on the right. He's a predator. And there's about a 4 or 5 week old cobia. And at night, I'd go down and take video of them attacking. These are aquatic insects, and these are polychaetes, a little invertebrate worm. And the cobia would come to the light to feed on these bugs, and you can see they're just wonderful predators, very aggressive. And notice the fan tail on these cobia. So the tail changes as they become more mature. It'll go and change into a fork type tail. So actually, if you have a light on a dock somewhere in the spring, you could actually see cobia feeding like this. And they love habitat just like the adults. We can put brick out in a tank and they'll all accumulate around it. And then they grow and we release them. And this is the cobia. And then all our bait species are fascinating. They all depend on the salt marsh. They either nurse here and grow up and then go offshore and become sexually mature and spawn offshore. And then they migrate, the larvae migrate back to the marshes and feed. So the marshes are a great nursery system for a number of species, whether they're commercially important, recreationally important to us, or just bait themselves. The marsh is a habitat where everything happens. Even our pigfish, they spawn in the spring, their second year. They feed on the bottom of mollusks and crustaceans in the marsh, or flounder, or sheep's head, all depend on the marsh. Black sea bass, somebody said, well, they don't depend on the inshore, but what they do is they do nurse in here, and then they move offshore and they provide food for other species like red snapper. So the marsh has created a fish that can actually go offshore and benefit other predator fish. Our black drum, our tarpon, we see those in the estuaries and some of the impoundments farther up the Port Royal Sound area. There's some impoundments there. The larvae will recruit there. And our juvenile tarpon actually found on sea pines that wash in through the water control structures. Spanish mackerel depend on they nurse here inside the sounds. So do your scamp grouper, so do your gag grouper, and either your Goliath grouper have been found in the coastal areas here. They actually come into Port Royal Sound and will feed. This is not a spawning site for them, but they do migrate probably from around Florida into Port Royal Sound and have been caught there feeding. Our mangrove snappers, many of us have caught these in our tidal creeks. Mangrove snapper, red snapper, and triple tail, which is kind of a new fish that we see here, and they're using our coastal habitat, our marsh habitat now, and they probably spawn and nurse. The larvae migrate inshore and nurse here now, and it's become a target species for recreational fishermen. And so much that now it's regulated by the Department of Natural Resources. And here's another one, snook. They're starting to show up in the upper reaches of the estuaries, even in the fall. I've been getting calls about what is this fish? So we're seeing snook here, which we haven't seen as much. We have seen them over the years, but not as much as we're seeing them now. I get a couple calls a year. Sturgeon, we get calls about seeing those. Some people see them jump in the sound. Short nose were caught up in the upper reaches of the May River. So we have both short nose and Atlantic sturgeon here. Striped bass, they've been showing up in New River, and I used to catch them in February in Broad River in the upper reaches. So they're here as well. And I would be excited to see a bonefish show up here. They caught one in Charleston this year, and I think we have a better habitat, better structure for bonefish than Charleston and high salinity. So I think eventually we'll see bonefish caught here, and I'll be very excited about that. This is the bonefish. They're actually spawning them now at Florida Atlantic University at Harbor Branch. So they're talking about this fish is so important to Florida Keys, valued at $465 million in the Keys themselves. And I wanted to throw that. Somebody said, well, you know, there's lancet fish out there. This was one caught in North Carolina, and it's a cannibal-like fish, will eat sharks and everything else. And that's the key. They'll eat sharks, and those sharks probably nursed inside the estuaries, could have nursed into Port Royal Sound. So everybody's depending on, all these fish species and all are depending on the salt marsh to be able to function as a habitat for recreational and commercial fish. That's just an amazing place. Well, I kind of rushed through all this. I hope it was okay. I get all wound up when I start talking about fishing and salt marsh and habitat. And Beaufort County is just unique from an environmental standpoint. We're very blessed to be living here. And that's it. I don't want to keep you all here all day.
If you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the chat box. And if you do, we'll wait a minute to give you a chance to type. But also want to let you know that we are announcing that our May meeting will be at the Port Royal Beer Garden.
Woo!
So hopefully that will get you very excited about next month. We're certainly excited about it because it is green drinks. So make sure that you put the first Tuesday in May on your calendar, and we'll see each other in person. So we're really excited about that. Let's see, not seeing any questions. We'll hang out here for a minute or two and see if anybody has any questions. Ale is always so informative, so relevant to our audience and to our region. So thank you so much. I always learn something every time I hear you. So
well, thank you very much.
Here's one question. Is Bay Point considered a hammock?
Is Bay Point considered a what?
A hummock.
Is it, I have to apologize. I haven't been to Bay Point. Is it an island?
I think it's an island.
Yeah, then it would be considered a hammock. Yeah.
Okay.
We have about 1,400 of them in Beaufort County. Even some of them are very small. You'll just see a couple salt cedars and a palmetto growing on them, and that's actually considered a hummock. And probably with sea level rise, we may lose some, and we'll probably gain some others in the upper reaches of the estuary.
So what's the difference, if you can summarize the difference between a hummock and an island?
An island is just a bigger hammock.
All right.
Is that like,
When I see a little one, see a little bump with a few trees on it, that's a hummock. If I go out and see an island where you have to get out and walk around it, it's an island.
like the difference between a boat and a ship?
Yeah.
Yeah, 50. I always heard it was 50 feet. Maybe that's the difference of a boat and a yacht. Anyway.
Yeah.
So one question comes about bonefish and about their economic impact. Why are they so important to Florida?
Well, they occur naturally in Florida, especially around the Keys, and it's a target species for recreational fishermen who like to fly fish. And so these guys have an art and specialized gear, and they hire these guides, and they go out there and try to catch large bonefish. So it's a big deal. But I mean, you don't eat them, you just catch and release. But it's a challenge for one thing, sort of like some people like to be bow hunters. for certain species of animal. It's a challenge to try to be able to do that.
Okay. Another question, what's the difference between a barrier island and a hummock island?
A barrier island is usually considered larger, like Hilton Head is a barrier island. Edisto is a barrier island. Hummocks are just mostly small bumps in the marsh or even larger ones. But yeah, barrier islands are usually considered larger, in my opinion. It's one of those things that really don't have a fine definition.
Yeah.
I don't think Hilton Head wants to be known as a large hummock.
And what's the status of the cobia population in this area these days?
Well, you know, they put a moratorium on them from harvesting them in May to allow them to spawn. That's the peak spawning period. And then they reduce the numbers that you can capture. And so they're doing steps. And then Waddell, working with geneticists, has been able to put out about 10,000 fish a year. And that was the numbers that they felt comfortable with putting out, that were a percentage would make it and become producers in three to 4 years. So they're trying to rebuild it because there's two populations of cobia that occur in South Carolina. One is an offshore population that spawns offshore, larvae migrate inshore. Then there's a population that actually migrate into Port Royal Sound, in Calabogie, St. Helena Sound. They come inshore and they spawn here, which is very unique for cobia. They don't generally go into a large body of water, but we're just an extension of the Atlantic Ocean. If you think about it, we're deep, we're wide, and we have high, continuous, high salinity waters. So they come in here and they spawn. So genetically, they're totally different. We can get DNA from fish offshore and tell you which group of fish they come from. Well, this group comes inshore to spawn, so everybody knows they're coming here. So they are targeted by recreational fishermen. They spawn when they're 3.5 to 4 years old. They are short-lived species. Generally, if you see a fish that's 8 or 9 years old, it's pretty old. I think we've captured one fish and she was 14, but she wasn't fertile. So senility will play a role in it. So if you think about it, they only have 5 or 6 years that they can actually spawn. So it's just such a small window. And with fishing pressure on them, those populations were overfished. So we're going to give them a chance. Now, those rules have only been in place, I think, 4 years. And then we've been putting fish out for 3 years. So hopefully this year we'll start seeing some fish caught that were benefited from the regulations in the stocking program. So things should start, we should start getting good data on that.
Okay. Are tours still available at Waddell?
No, I talked to Aaron, the new manager, the other day, and there's still state and DNR policies that won't allow tours, but they renovated the lab. They got $1 million and to renovate it, and it looks really good. They hired a PhD out of Florida, and he did some great things in that wet lab. It's never looked so good. I was there 40 years, and I'm going, y'all make me look bad. But they were able to get some grants and do some things. Before I left, I was involved with the renovation, and we put one pair of air systems in there, which dried the wet lab out, got a lot of things done, insulated the building, new tanks, all this. We had some nice donations from fishing groups, the Waddell Fund, people donate money to the Waddell Fund, and they've really done a good job fixing up the lab. And I think y'all, I hope they'll open it up soon so y'all can come and go for a tour. It's going to be really good. It's a unique facility, unlike just about anywhere else.
Well, Al, those are the only questions I see. So unless someone has anything else, I think we'll conclude for this month, and we'll see you all next month at the beer garden. So
I give you my cell number. Y'all can call me at home. Everybody else does. So you...
Well, we're happy to publish that if you want us to.
No. I got a call one time at like 11 o'clock. The guy said, me and my buddies arguing about this regulation. Can you help me? I said, are y'all drinking? Of course.
Yeah, we don't want to encourage that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Al.
Thanks
Thank
y'all
you,
for
Al.
having me. I
Great.
appreciate it.
All right. See y'all.